Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This is our last Sunday of humming a sermon, and we're going to do things just a little bit differently today. Today, I'd like to start our sermon off by singing the first two verses of our hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. You'll find it number 475 in the purple hymnal, number 356 in the blue hymnal. So let's sing with Mark and Dan verses 1 and 2 together.
Be right there, 475.
We're working on it.
All right.
Come the fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of God's unchanging love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus taught me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, you rescue me from danger, interpose his precious blood.
Thank you, Mark and Dan. When I wrote them and said we're doing things differently, the hymn will be at the beginning and end of my sermon. Dan said, well, what will we do during your sermon? Oh, wait. So good one, Dan. This hymn, whenever people sing this hymn, there is one question that we always ask. I'm going to put us on gallery view for just a moment. Any guesses as to what the one big question for this hymn is? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you've got a guess. Yes, Wolfgang. Oh, I got asked to unmute.
Wolfgang. What's an Ebenezer?
What's an Ebenezer? Perfect. What on earth is an Ebenezer?
A helper.
That's right. That's right. So let me find where the sermon is. I got too excited about that. There it is. What on earth is an Ebenezer? It's a good question. This is not a word that we use in everyday life. What is an Ebenezer? Why are we raising it? And for goodness sakes, if we don't even know what it is, why are we singing about it? In fact, some hymnal editors have decided that this word is too strange and have tried to edit it out. They replace the line, here I raise my Ebenezer, with hitherto thy love has blessed me, or here by grace your love has brought me, or here I raise to thee an altar, etc., etc., etc. But of course, none of these revisions has quite the thrust of the original. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come. So, what is an Ebenezer? As Mindy said, it's a helper. The word Ebenezer is actually a combination of two Hebrew words. Eben, which means stone, and Ezer, which means help, salvation, or deliverance. In the Hebrew Bible, an Ebenezer is a monument erected to acknowledge the presence and the help of God. We heard about an Ebenezer in today's Old Testament reading from 1 Samuel that Jim read for us just a few moments ago. The ancient Israelites have been at war, and when Samuel prays to God, the Israelites finally prevail. So when the battle is over, they acknowledge their victory and their dependence upon God by setting up a rock, an Ebenezer. Literally, the text tells us, a stone of help. This happens often in the Old Testament. The Hebrew people have encounters with God, and they set up an altar of stones as a reminder. Jacob sets up a stone at Bethel after God appears to him in a dream in the story of Jacob's ladder. Moses builds a monument at the foot of Mount Sinai when he receives the 10 Commandments, the Torah. Joshua sets up 12 stones to commemorate how the Lord led the people, the 12 tribes of Israel, across the Jordan and into the promised land. And again, Joshua erects another stone at Shechem when the Hebrews renew their covenant with their God. These stones, these Ebenezers, remind those who built them and all the generations to come how God met them and helped them and saved them in a particular time and place. Disconnected as we may be from the ancient Israelite culture, I do think that we who live in the Southwest understand this practice of raising Ebenezers better than most. Because it seems to me that an Ebenezer is a lot like a cairn, those little piles of rocks that we make on the mesa or in the mountains to mark which way the trail goes. Cairns are an invaluable resource to hikers and campers. They keep us on the right path. They reorient us when we lose our way. They guide the way back home. Cairns have helped me find my way up and down the canyon walls on the way to Kitchen Mesa at Ghost Ranch. They've guided me through meadows on the Elliott Barker trails and in the Columbine Canyon. Perhaps they've guided some of you as well. Whenever I get confused or disoriented on a trail, I always pause and look for a cairn to guide the way. Years ago, before I even moved to Taos, my friend Jane preached a sermon about cairns. And she told us that from ancient Israel to the Scottish Isles to the Incan Empire to us today, that cairns are structures not just of geographical significance, but of spiritual significance. Cairns serve as markers along the life journeys of individuals and of nations. They mark a crossroads, an important junction, a place where something happened that changed the course of a life or of history. Cairns invite us to pause for a moment, to take in the scene around us, to reflect on the journey, where we are going and where we've been. In her sermon that day, Jane challenged us, the congregation, and so now I challenge you to think for a moment about our own lives and faith journeys. What are those moments of significance? What crossroads have we come to? Where have we gotten lost and needed reorientation? Where has God appeared to us in one way or another? Perhaps it's a particularly significant place or an important decision we've had to make. Perhaps God came to us in a relationship and a person in our lives who shaped us and left us changed. Where have we set up spiritual cairns, raised our Ebenezers to signify that something important has happened? Where are those places where God has entered our stories and was so deeply present that we were never again the same? This hymn actually bears witness to a spiritual cairn, an Ebenezer, in the life of its author. Robert Robinson, who wrote the words, "To come thou fount of every blessing," was born into a poor English family in the 18th century. He left home at a young age to be apprenticed to a barber and fell in with a bad crowd as a teenager. In 1752, at the age of 17, Robinson and his band of hoodlums found their way to a revival put on by that famous traveling preacher, George Whitefield, known as the founder of the Second Great Awakening. Robert and friends went to heckle the crowd of believers. But, he wrote later, something happened to him that day. A seed was planted in Robert Robinson, something changed, and over the next 3 years, he experienced what he described as an inner transformation. He could no longer live his old way of life anymore. At the age of 23 years later, Robinson made the decision to become a Christian. And a few years later, he found himself pastoring a church in Norfolk, England. He wrote this hymn for Pentecost Sunday at his very first church as a testament to the outpouring of grace he experienced in his own process of conversion. That much is documented history. What follows is more of an urban legend, we might say. We don't know if it really happened or not, but the story offers us a lot. According to tradition, Robinson, who wrote these words, "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love," did indeed wander away from the path of faith in the later years of his life. And one day he found himself riding in a stagecoach with a young woman who was humming, believe it or not, this hymn, "Come thou fount of every blessing." She asked the scraggly old man sitting next to her, the man that Robinson had become, if he'd heard this song before. Divine irony has a way, doesn't it? As the legend goes, Robinson looked at her and responded, "Madam, I am the poor, unhappy man who wrote that hymn many years ago. And I would give 1,000 worlds if I had them, to enjoy the feelings that I had then." Seeing the pain, the weariness on Robinson's face, the woman reached out her hand to him and said gently, "Sir, those streams of mercy are still flowing. The faith, the God you left is still there. You can still find your way back home." That's what cairns are for, isn't it? They guide the way back home. Sometimes we find the way ourselves, and sometimes someone has to point it out to us, to reorient us, to guide us back to the cairns that we have constructed. Sometimes we make our way home, guided by stones and Ebenezers that others have set up before us. And then sometimes God comes and finds us right where we are. Jesus sought me when a stranger, Robinson writes, wandering from the fold of God. Sometimes it seems it is Jesus himself who follows the cairns we have constructed along the way, comes and finds us like the shepherd who searches for his lost sheep. And when he finds us, he rejoices, hoists us up on his shoulders, and carries us safely back home. So friends, companions on the journey, you who are following in the footsteps of Jesus and building cairns along the way, take a moment. Take a moment to just stop and look around. Drink from that fount of every blessing, bask and revel in the grace that surrounds us. Let the streams of mercy wash over you. You are God's beloved. You and everyone else. We belong this day and always to a God, to a shepherd who is always guiding us back home. Let us sing verse 3 of this hymn together. Number 475 in your purple hymnal and 356 in the blue. I'm bringing in
Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let that grace now like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Hear my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts